We've totally altered the world. We've altered the fundamental climate of the world.
There are many threats to forests, and one of the reasons that we worry a lot about it is because forests play an important role in fixing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and so the fewer trees and the less vegetation in the world, the faster the world will warm.
What would not be sustainable would be to walk away from some of our forests and forest landscapes at this point and leave it to nature to adjust to the changes that we have wrought. Not just climate change, but also the incredible way in which we've facilitated the movement of insects and diseases around the globe. The incredible way in which we've altered the structures of these forests, fragmented these landscapes.
Human beings have driven the world temperature up about 1 degree Celsius, about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, let's say since the 1920s. And we're continuing to drive the temperature up, and we do that by pumping out about 16 kinds of greenhouse gases, of which the best known one is carbon dioxide. And in dominating the atmosphere, those gases cause what's called a greenhouse effect. They occur in the atmosphere, so the sun's rays come through the atmosphere, and then the heat is trapped under them increasingly. The thicker those gases make the atmosphere, so to speak. Trees and other forms of vegetation are very effective in fixing carbon dioxide, in taking it in converting it through the process of photosynthesis, which all green organisms have, into the molecules that make up their bodies.
The majority of our forest estate, global forest estate, we're going to have to participate with it in some way. And I like to think in terms of a collaboration between man as the manager and steward and nature. But that collaboration has to be based on a comprehensive understanding of the system and how it works.
Does climate change enable the emerald ash borer to get around more easily than it would have without climate change? Certainly a really dry summer like we had 3 years ago killed lots of trees in the natural forest. And we will see more and more effects because lots of the kinds of crops, including tree crops and agricultural crops, and lots of kinds of the plants and animals that we have simply are not going to be able to survive where they are now as the years go by, and as slowly as we seem to be getting on with any agreement about global warming.
We live in an extremely uncertain century, and it's not just climate change. It's not even just environmental change. But also, we live in an extraordinarily uncertain century from the standpoint of societal goals. Also, we live in a very uncertain world in terms of the potential for invasives, because we're transporting them back and forth between continents like there was no tomorrow. And so that suggests to me that the prudent manager is going to manage this forest system to try to minimize risks, increase options. Now, that's not what corporations do. Corporations are risk-taking organizations. And if you're a corporation that's growing wood, you might say, climate change, if it becomes a problem, I cut down the woods I got, just plant another woods. Or I sell out. Get out of the forestry business completely. So they deal with risk in a very different way than someone who's committed to sustaining a forest property in perpetuity. Trusts, including things like state trust land, federal, Indian reservations, even many private forest landowners who have no intention of getting rid of their forest. It's an integral part of their home life. So for those people who can't essentially just convert to a different crop or sell out, but are committed to long term, it seems to me you've got to be constantly thinking about increasing options, reducing risks, and so much of that to me is diversification. Managing in a way that you're not dependent on a single species or even 2 or 3 species. It's one of the reasons I'm very concerned about the forests of the Pacific Northwest, because we are so at risk because we depend on just 1 or 2 species for our natural forests and for our managed forests. So, we're in a high-risk situation.
Climate change is ultimately the most serious challenge that humanity has ever confronted, because other challenges that we've confronted was when our population was much sparser and we could adapt in ways that we can't adapt anymore. 12,000 years ago, which is roughly the time that human beings invented agriculture after their 2 million year earlier history on Earth, the entire human population of the world was about 3 or 4 million people, much smaller than that of many cities in the United States, occupying all of the continents of the world. Now we've grown to 1 billion people early in the 19th century, 2 billion people around 1930, and on to 7.1 billion people now, all demanding to be able to consume more and more and basically using more than the world can produce. And as a result of that, any change in the system that produces food, that produces shelter, clothing, medicines, or anything else is going to be very hard on us because we have less wiggle room. We simply have fewer places to go. We have fewer places to grow food. We have fewer ways to adapt to the modern situation. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there are about 900 million people now. They're projected to grow to 2.2 billion people in the next 37 years, in other words, by the middle of the century. And anyone who knows anything about Africa knows the difficulties there now are enormous. In the United States, we survive at a very high level of consumption and fast rate, essentially by importing things from other places. And if other places collapse, we're going to be in real trouble in preserving our own forests and conservation areas and all the rest.
Well, we do have one last request, and this is from Nalini. She specifically asked if you could give us a few bars of "I Talk to the Trees."
No.
You can say no, but she did ask.
All right. That's funny.